yesterday, we left off with affirmative action. Again, affirmative action has now been voted down by the Supreme Court. Affirmative action it regards showing favor in regards to like employment and educational opportunities to groups of people who historically have perhaps had barriers to that, right? So whether it's people of color, women, etc. Okay, the Supreme Court has since ruled that affirmative action can no longer be used as said precedent in determining those things. Okay, that it was unconstitutional. All right. We had then gotten into the civil rights movement a little bit. Again, we said we weren't going to spend a whole ton of time discussing who Martin Luther King Jr. was, just because that's something that you guys are familiar with. But after the Brown versus Board of Education case, which, by the way, is the only civil rights case we've discussed this unit, okay, we then start to see the integration of schools, right, based on race. And so in the 1950s, a couple of years after now the Brown v. Board case, we are going to see our Congress is going to pass a variety of laws trying to outline and protect those civil rights. So like the Civil Rights Act of 1957, that had been the first civil rights law passed in like 80 years, okay, involving the treatment of African Americans and other ethnic minorities. Okay, and so the civil rights movement is an example of a social movement. We have talked about what that is before, and many of the instances when we talk like the African American civil rights movement, which again I want to be very clear about this, is one of the many civil rights movements that has occurred in U.S. history. It's maybe the most well-known, well-documented. But a lot of these groups preached civil disobedience, and that is the idea that they would disobey laws that they viewed that were unfair as a result to try to bring about change. Okay, and so Martin Luther King Jr., who was one of the major, maybe perhaps the most important leader of said African American civil rights movement throughout the 1950s and 60s, is going to take a variety of actions in this. And again, he stressed nonviolent protest. He's going to help lead a Montgomery bus boycott, again, Montgomery, Alabama, despite segregation and there being a ruling on segregation not being constitutional. The city of Montgomery, Alabama, still nonetheless attempted to segregate its public transportation on the bus system. There will be a movement organized to boycott the bus system to bring about attention to the unfairness, the inequality that existed in segregating buses. And so people in Montgomery, when you boycott something, you're just not going to do it. As a result, later on, a variety of courts, federal courts, are going to find that the Montgomery law segregating its public transportation system was unconstitutional. Okay, and that's kind of like the beginning of Martin Luther King Jr.'s work. Okay, again, I don't think you're going to see it on an AP exam, but he was the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which I guess would have been one of these social groups, so to speak, maybe in perhaps an interest group. But a lot of his work was focused on the southern states where you saw some of the staunchest, most stingy segregation rules. And so Birmingham, Alabama, perhaps the most segregated city in the United States, had passed some city laws saying that if there were marches or things of that nature, that you would be arrested and thrown in jail for leading that form of protest, a march. And so Martin Luther King Jr. and his organization, they decide to challenge that. And they lead this peace march in Birmingham, Alabama, involving the issue of segregation. Okay, and there you see some images from that. On the right there of center, there you see a Martin Luther King Jr. marching through Birmingham in May of 1963. Okay, as a result of his organization of this Birmingham Peace March, Dr. King is arrested for violating the local law. Who read through the letter from Birmingham jail yesterday? You were supposed to have done that if you at least started. Okay, who read the letter that Dr. King responded to? That one was a little bit shorter. Okay, that is not a required document, the letter that he responds to, but the letter from Birmingham jail is a foundational document for AP. And it's long, okay? But here's the thing, like, after King was arrested for organizing this march, various members of the church clergy from Birmingham, Alabama, some of whom, like there is a Jewish rabbi who also signs his name on this document. They basically write to Dr. King saying, hey, if you keep violating these laws, like that's going to bring about a bad look for you and other African Americans. Like, quit doing that. Like, you're not making things better. You are actually making them worse. And so then in response to that letter is where the letter from Birmingham jail is born. Martin Luther King Jr., like that long document that you were supposed to have read, he wrote that on newspaper clippings because he didn't have a notebook or anything. So he'd get like the jail guards to bring him a newspaper, and on scraps of newspaper, he pieced together this very powerful response to the church clergy. And if you read the letter, which you still need to if you haven't, okay, because we're not going to take all the time in class to go through and read it because it is very long. But the essence of it is that Martin Luther King Jr. he had every reason, if you read the letter that he was responding to, he had every reason in the world to probably go off on those guys who had written to him while he was in jail, right? Some of the things that they had said, like, I don't think anybody as a human would have blamed him for that. But in the letter from Birmingham jail, like, he is super formal. I'd go as far as saying he was being very kind. He was trying to kill him with kindness. Okay, and he basically just says, I respectfully disagree with your position, and here's why. And he talks about the founding of the United States, all men being created equal, and where the United States has fallen short with that. An example of that being this lack of the right to peacefully protest, this lack of a right to participate, how African Americans are being treated. And in the letter from Birmingham jail, perhaps the biggest claim that he makes is that if unjust laws exist, is that in order to get change, those laws need to be disobeyed to bring about attention to the unfairness and the inequality that exists. And that's the basis of this letter from Birmingham jail. And he's very kind with his words, but lays out his position that I'm not going to budge on this because the United States is not fulfilling what it promised in the Declaration of Independence. It's not. And he brings attention to that. So that is the essence of the letter from Birmingham jail, which again, that is a required document that you need to be aware of. And so then here you see some of the images from the Birmingham Peace March or the Birmingham March where literally those who were marching were attacked by police dogs. They were sprayed down with fire hoses. Like, there was some very icky things that happened. I feel like last year in U.S. history, maybe watched some of the coverage of it. It's horrifying, okay, that these people were having a peaceful protest and the way that it was disbanded was in a totally unpeaceful way. But after this, excuse me, Congress is going to bring about a whole variety of civil rights laws. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it's a federal law. Again, it all happens here basically in response to what happened in Birmingham, Alabama. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1964, federal law that says public places and schools have to be desegregated. And it gave the United States federal government the permission to take action to do so. Okay, again, so when we look at the argument FRQ that you guys started working on yesterday, who did more for the advancement of equality of opportunity? Well, we've talked about 3 examples just of laws today that are civil rights laws. Okay, another civil rights law that's passed around the same time is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Again, African Americans at this point have had the right to vote for nearly 100 years. But southern states were still trying to find ways to prevent that from happening. Poll taxes, literacy tests, whatever. And so the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it now includes some other provisions. But when it was first passed, it dealt with literacy tests. And it said that using literacy tests as a requirement to vote was unconstitutional. That's a prime example of a civil rights law. Okay, those are addressing some of the concerns of this group, this portion of the population of people that Martin Luther King Jr. and others were trying to fight for. to advance these civil rights. Okay, but both of those laws are things that are required that you should know what they are. Okay, questions on this? All right, starting to wrap up then too. Another big civil rights movement is the fight for women's rights. Okay, that's an example of civil rights as well. And so at various times in U.S. history, women simply have not had the same rights as men. Okay, and that is fact. Okay, that is fact. And voting is one of those very key examples. Again, the 19th Amendment, being aware of what that is, that's an example of civil rights reform. Okay, again, amendments coming from Congress. The 19th Amendment gets ratified in the year 1920. Women now all have the right to vote. About 30 years, actually longer than that. I know there's people in this room, and I know all of you have heard of her because you should have. Susan B. Anthony, who's kind of like the founder of the women's rights movement. In 1872, she got arrested for registering to vote. So you're talking about 50 years before this. She got arrested, and the Supreme Court upheld that arrest. Okay? So in 1920, there you have the 19th Amendment, shortly after the end of World War I, gets ratified. Well, now starting in the 1960s, again, the African American civil rights movement, a lot of attention, well documented. And again, clearly there were some issues there with the equality and how African Americans were being treated. Like that's not a debatable thing. But in the 60s, that starts to kind of fuel this women's movement. Okay, like work, jobs, voting rights, serving in government. What does that all look like? And the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which again would also have been on the previous slide, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 also included something about discrimination in the workplace based on gender. Okay, because again, starting in the 60s and 70s, after World War II, I mean, women start to rapidly enter the job force, right? It was a very, very much a changing time in that regard, where prior to World War II, it was kind of unheard of for a female to work outside of the home unless they absolutely had to. Okay? And so this women's movement becomes a particularly big thing, especially in regards to education. And so this is a major law. This is something that still very much affects us to this day, and that's the Title IX. Okay, so in 1972, there was an education bill that was passed. And as a part of this Higher Education Act, there's a portion of that law that's called Title IX. And more or less what Title IX does, it doesn't do a whole multitude of things. But the one thing Title IX does is it required schools, public schools, to increase female participation in extracurricular activities, namely sports. It paves the way for the creation of girls basketball, volleyball, girls swimming, you name the sport, okay? And now like any educational institution that receives federal funding, there has to be a ratio of men's sports to women's sports, okay? Even college level, high school level, etc. There has to be a ratio. So you talk about, the example that I bring up here is with UND. It's been a few years now, 5 of them maybe, but UND cut its baseball team, okay, its men's baseball team. They had to do that because per Title IX in this ratio, when women's hockey got cut by UND, which again is kind of flabbergasting to me still because it's UND and they're known for hockey. But when they cut their women's hockey program, the school also had to cut a men's program to be in compliance with Title IX, okay? And there's other elements to Title IX as well. It mostly focuses on female participation in extracurriculars, sports, but there's also some other elements to it. There's a sexual harassment element to it as well, okay? That public entities, schools also have to follow. So it's not just limited to sports. There's some other instances there too where, again, there's some sexual harassment portions of this too, things that also have to be followed. Okay, it's kind of it's interesting. Okay, it is, and did some very important things for the United States, obviously. In the 70s, there was a proposed amendment called the Equal Rights Amendment, and it was passed by Congress, but it never got ratified by the states, and therefore it's kind of died. And there you see in the quotation marks what that amendment to the U.S. Constitution, how it would have been worded. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on the account of sex. Congress passed it, 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate. It never got ratified by the states, and it kind of fizzled out. A big reason for that comes back is a lot of states during that time, 1980s, even into the present day, a lot of the states would come back and say, well, our state has laws in place that are basically the same thing, and they would argue that the amendment was not necessary. Okay, again, there are still those who would say, this is very much a necessary thing in this day and age. Okay, and again, this is the last couple things. Gender discrimination, sexual harassment. In order to be charged with such things, there is a legal standard that has to be met, either strict scrutiny or a rational basis. Those two things are not things that will be tested on, but in order for somebody to be found guilty of crimes related to those things, there has to be examples of one of those two things shown in said case. Okay? And that is the end of the Civil Rights Unit. Okay, so again, we talked about a lot of laws. And remember, where do these laws come from? Where do they start? Who passes laws in the United States? Who makes laws? Congress. So I want you to think back to that here too when we are doing our working here on our argument FRQ. All right, and I'm going to stop this.